Welcome back to another installment, another session, another episode of the Baseball Pandemic Book Club. And we've got Thom Henninger with us today. He's the editor of Baseball Digest magazine, which we might dive into a little bit later. But he's got a great new book out. I got to hold this up. There it is. And it's called The Pride of Minnesota. And it's all about the Twins and the turbulent 1960s, which I know a little bit about from my book, Summer of '68. And it's out now in hardcover from University of Nebraska Press. And Thom, welcome aboard. Welcome to the Baseball Pandemic Book Club.
Well, thank you. Good to be here.
Yes. This is a marvelous read, by the way. And as one who has done a little bit of writing back in my Baseball Weekly days about the Twins, I was an American League guy. One thing I love about this is you, in a sense, grew up with this team, following them. What was it like to go in Mr. Peabody's Wayback Machine and in a sense revisit these times and revisit these players and these teams?
Well, it was wonderful to do, and it really kind of forced me to relive some things and brought back a lot of memories, things I'd forgotten, things I didn't know. The research was just a tremendous amount of fun. So really enjoyed doing it.
Yeah. Anything there, off the top of your head kind of surprised you in a way where you're looking, well, hang on, I was there, I lived this, but this is what really happened?
Oh, wow. Well, I guess just, it really was some of the non-baseball things, to be honest with you. Kind of exploring what Hubert Humphrey's relationship was to LBJ in the day, and
Yes.
Some of the ins and outs of that presidential race, which was very front and center in Minnesota. We had two Minnesota candidates, Eugene McCarthy and Hubert Humphrey, and vying for the Democratic nomination that year. And that just made for some remarkable stories. I just could have written a whole book about that, believe it or not.
Yeah, I find it marvelous when baseball kind of intersects with our culture and our society and our politics, because it does so with a great regularity. Okay, let's dive into some of these great players. And we got to probably get some people up to speed, because some people know the Twins, other people maybe not as much. But I'd love to go through and get your impressions and recollections of some of these great players. And let's start with Harman Killebrew. And again, maybe what surprised you, but just give people a little bit of a thumbnail too. Harman Killebrew, the player.
Well, he was certainly one of the great sluggers of the game. I don't think any doubt he was the best slugger the Twins ever had, for sure. And, just a remarkable player. He actually signed with the Senators after hitting a monstrous home run in high school. And the Senators gave him quite a bonus. And remarkably, he learned later, well, the other team in pursuit was the Boston Red Sox. Oh. And he did admit to having misgivings when he made his first trip to Fenway Park and realized what it would have meant to be hitting in that park. Looking back, what stands out to me more than anything is just what a decent and humble man he was. The first time I met him, it was at the Metrodome. And he would come in town for the autograph party. They had an autograph party out in front of the stadium. People paid a flat fee, then they could go in and get signatures from former Twins, current Twins. And so I showed up at the Metrodome one day, and I'm waiting in the lobby, and I learned that I'm his first visitor, and they always booked him heavily. He had a full schedule when he'd come in town. So, and he's coming from the airport, and I'm waiting for him and getting more nervous as I waited. And I think he picked up on that, but he just was extremely warm to me right from the start, made me feel comfortable. And then we went to a conference room and had to walk through most of the front office. And I was just blown away. He stopped at literally every desk. He knew everyone's name. He referenced a story, asked how their husband was, and literally did that all the way back to the conference room. And I was just amazed, just such a humble, decent man, and always made himself available when I asked him.
Oh, that sounds great. A man of the people. All right, let's go. Another guy, roughly this time period, but certainly ends up with the Twins in very different in different ways, different circumstances. I hope you'll touch on that. But Tony Oliva, and you've done another book about Tony, but kind of tell us a little bit about him as the ball player, but also maybe just as important, how he ended up coming to the Twins.
Yes, well, I was just mesmerized by this guy as a hitter. He could literally hit any pitch in any location. one of the great bad ball hitters, kind of like Yogi Berra in his day and Vladimir Guerrero later on, senior, of course. And I just love the guy. And he did have a remarkable backstory. He grew up in a very remote part of Cuba on a small family farm. He came here for a tryout at a time the Bay of Pigs invasion happened, and the CIA orchestrated an attempt to overthrow Castro. And he basically had to make a decision to stay here and never go home, or possibly never go home, or stay and or return to Cuba. No, he'd never get another chance, and he did stay behind. Just was a remarkably lonely man for the first few years. Just missed family and friends, and didn't know the language, struggled with all the things that any Latin player would in that day. But he was really remarkable at compartmentalizing that, and it didn't affect him on the field. And most of his teammates didn't have a sense of what he was going through. He shared that with the other Cubans, but not many other people had any sense of that. And yet he went on to have nearly a Hall of Fame career.
Yeah, just phenomenal hitter. Let's switch over to maybe a pitcher or two. Jim Cott, I mean, here's the kind of the workhorse of the teams again in the 60s. I'm gonna hold up the cover again. There we go. And your impressions of him, and certainly some people may remember him even more so, being on TV, being analyst, being part of the World Series broadcasts and such. But what stood out for you with Jim?
Well, one thing that was critical for the Twins was that he and Camilo Pascual were young pitchers with the Senators, and they developed into, two of the core players for the franchises that moved to Minnesota, and they were key in making the team a better team. And that goes along with young guys, Harman Killebrew, Bob Allison, Earl Batty, and a few others. And Cott developed into a very dependable pitcher. Maybe didn't get as much attention as you might have thought on a team of many stars, but just was a consistent winner, a consistent contributor. And I think if you combine his 283 wins, along with a remarkable broadcasting career, maybe even on baseball alone, he belongs in the Hall of Fame. But I think you combine the two, this remarkably articulate man, well-spoken man. I've really come to really like him. He was very helpful in my projects, and I do think he belongs in the Hall.
I tend to agree. I think you put both of those things together. I mean, I can't think of anybody who was a greater student of the game than Jim, and and also just being open. I mean, he helps. With your new book, he's helped with a couple of mine, and he's like one of those guys I just love talking baseball about because I know I'm going to learn a little bit more about it.
Exactly. Yes.
Mudcat Grant, one of my favorites.
Yeah, certainly. And just a wonderful storyteller, as I'm sure you found out. Led a remarkable life. Sadly, we've lost him. Worked on JFK's campaign very briefly and got to meet JFK. Had a lot to say about racism in the game. He grew up in a small town in segregated Florida, prior to the war. Tracks running down the middle of the town. Whites lived on one side, blacks on the other. Very typical of the era, of course. And, really could explain the story, what it meant to grow up black in America, and just gave me some remarkable anecdotes for the book. I just absolutely loved the guy. I became quite close to him. I think a lot of writers did. It wasn't that unusual, but, had many long discussions with the guy and just really adored the guy.
Yeah, I second that. Couple more, and then we're going to segue maybe more into some more issue or trend related questions. But I want to do these next couple folks because, when you say their names now, I think they, at least for me, don't necessarily get thought of with the Twins necessarily. That's not the cap I imagine on their head, for maybe Hall of Fame if it's going that way or something. And the first one, of course, is Rod Carew. Comes up with the Twins, but maybe you think of him, at least I do, maybe more at the Angels, something like that. But what was he like, and what did he bring to this team, and how did he fit in?
Well, he was a bit of a moody kid growing up. There were some issues there, but he had Tony Oliva as a mentor, and the one time I only talked to him once, but the one time I did talk to him, he couldn't say enough about Tony, what a wonderful mentor he was, and really did contribute to the skills that he developed. He realized Tony had sort of a photographic memory of sorts about pitchers, what they threw, what to look for in a certain count. And, undoubtedly that kind of mentoring would be a phenomenal asset for a guy like Carew. And the two of them were opposite hitters. Oliva would swing
Sure were.
Carew was so disciplined and would place the ball and was just a completely different hitter. But the two of them kind of dominated the American League batting races for about a decade. So
yeah, very much. And couple of things you touch on in the pride of Minnesota is with Carew is, certainly, I forgot about him a little bit, but his flirtations with hitting 400, being the first guy since Ted Williams. And also, I had totally forgotten how adept he was at stealing home. I mean, that was great. And just how it became part of his game early on. And, and I find myself thinking of stealing home, triples, the way the game's played today. I go, wow, I'd love to see somebody steal home some night when I'm watching it on TV. He was great at it.
Yeah, it was something Billy Martin tutored him on when he became manager in '69. And, Carew picked up on it very quickly. It was sort of getting a walking lead and taking off. And he got a good feel for it. Martin really, this was kind of what Billy Martin was about. Terrific teacher, great on fundamentals, worked wonderfully with young kids, and Carew benefited immensely in '69.
Well, let's segue into that, because Martin was going to be kind of one of my next guys, because you say Billy Martin and you think the Yankees and Steinbrenner and all this, but get people up to speed. I mean, Martin really kind of has his first major toehold, at least managerial, in Minnesota. And like you say, is pivotal to a lot of guys' careers, not just Carew, but others. And just the style of play he had them playing was maybe a little bit ahead of its time.
Yes. And really his influence on the Twins began in '65 when he became the third base coach. And he took Zola Versailles under his wings. Zola was someone who was rather inconsistent, usually didn't perform that well in the second half. And Martin, in addition to being terrific about teaching fundamentals, was also a great morale booster. And this was just something that benefited a lot of young players. And he really did keep Versailles on an even keel for the entire season. And of course, he won the MVP. And there again, then Martin kind of played the same role in '69 with the Twins, or with Rod Carew. And all along the way, the other side of it is the Twins were kind of a power-laden club, didn't run. They were like the Red Sox in the early '60s, hardly stole any bases, and he made them a multi-dimensional team, going first to third repeatedly, taking that extra base when the ball was still on the ground in the outfield, pushing the limits, forcing fielders to make plays. And he just made the team so much more multi-dimensional than they had been prior to his arrival.
Well, that kind of begs the question. I found myself, I never really had thought of this till reading your great book, The Pride of Minnesota. I mean, you compare Martin, other places, New York certainly comes to mind, maybe in Oakland in some ways. He's not there that long. I mean, what happens with the franchise if for somehow things are different and Billy Martin is there for, a certain length of time? What happens with the team's fate or how they do?
Well, of course, Martin was there just the 1 year. There were a number of issues that, that led to his departure. Most of them were surrounding insubordination, in the words of Calvin Griffith. And, and I think it might have been a great career move for Martin that happened, because the Twins just were not, developing the talent they'd had been. Carew was literally the last, elite impact position player they developed in the '60s, and by the early '70s, Harman Killebrew and Tony Oliva each were pretty much playing on one healthy leg, and the talent just wasn't there. And so by '71, '72, I don't think it would have mattered who managed the Twins. They just weren't going to go anywhere. And Martin got the most out of players. It might have been a tad better, but it might have been a great career move to move on at that point. It might have affected his legacy if he would have stuck around and played through some miserable seasons with the Twins. So,
good point.
But it began there. So.
Yeah, it certainly began there, and quite, what a season and such too. Let's segue over, move around just a little bit. And one of the things that really stood out for me, I know that's what I love about books like yours is I feel like, oh yeah, I kind of know that. And then I read more and go, oh, I didn't know that. And one of the ones I'm touching now on is the pennant race in 1967. Give us kind of the snapshot. And I think you could argue, at least I was leaning this way after reading The Pride of Minnesota, the Twins maybe were the best team of that four-way race, and just didn't quite get the breaks. Disagree with me if you want, but let's do 67 and where the Twins fit in that epic pennant race.
I hadn't really framed it in those terms, but I think it's quite possible they were the most talented team. The White Sox were one of the four teams in that race. They were, heavily based on pitching and defense, traded for players down the stretch and just didn't have enough hitting to make it happen. The Tigers were awfully balanced as well, both pitching and hitting, lots of power. McLean and Lolich were on board. And, I would say they rated with the Twins as probably the two best teams going in. And the surprise team wasn't the Baltimore Orioles, of course, who had swept the Dodgers in the World Series the year before, but the Boston Red Sox, who had lost 90 games twice in 2 of the 3 previous seasons and had lost 100 in 1965. And they hired Dick Williams that spring, and Williams had the audacity to suggest the Red Sox were going to be at least a 5. They were going to win more than they lost, is what he said. And the writers thought he was crazy. Well, and of course, he's the Hall of Fame manager that he became. In his first year, did lead the Red Sox to the pennant. And they were the best team in the second half. They had the best record in the second half. Had a couple little bumps in the road, but then the season came down to 2 games at the end of the year at Fenway Park between the Twins and the Red Sox, and the Red Sox won both games. So. Yeah.
Go a little bit deeper though, Tom, into those final 2 games, because again, what you do so well in the book is, I don't want to say it's a what if, but the great thing I think you and I agree about baseball is you can come down to these moments, and if something goes over here a little bit more as opposed to over here, you've got a totally different outcome. And that's the way I kind of felt as you really detailed and described those last 2 games of the season.
Well, the sad development for the Twins is that Jim Cott, who had just pitched his absolute best down the stretch, I believe he'd made 7 or 8 September starts, won them all. Cott told me that was his absolutely best stretch of pitching in his career. He was just absolutely as good as he'd ever been. And so he gets the call for the first game, too, on the Saturday. And in the second inning, he has to leave with an elbow injury. And he was on his game. He looked good at that point. The injury was such that he would have had Tommy John surgery if it existed at the time. And he did bypass surgery altogether. In those days, surgery often marked the end of your career. But here you have the guy that been your ace for the last several months, several weeks of the season, and he has to leave the game. And shortly after that, things took a turn. And Yastrzemski, as usual, was a key player. He had a couple big hits, and it all fell apart. So that was critical. That was a key thing to lose Cott under such circumstances.
Yeah.
And then Gene Chance went the next day on short rest, and he'd gone 4-0 against the Red Sox, if I recall. He pitched a 5-inning no-hitter that I believe got rained out, and had really been on his game, but he pitched on short rest, and he wasn't the same that day. So there again, they fell.
And Chance, looking back on it, granted, we're 20/20 hindsight. Was he the guy to start in that game, or did they have maybe other options that potentially could have played out better for him?
Well, in an interview, Jim Perry had told me that he thought he should have been the guy. And I think it would have been, a fine decision. But, there again, I think managers will often do what will, involve the least second guessing when the game is over. And, I guess you go with your ace, I don't know how often Chance pitched on short rest that season. Probably very seldom, but it probably did seem like the obvious decision to most people. And it wasn't a decision I was making at that point at age 13. but you look back now and it's easy to say, yeah, maybe Jim Perry, maybe someone else, but that's the way it played out.
Yeah, that's why we're in the seats we're in. We get to second guess them all we want.
That's right. And interestingly, the inning that blew it open for Chance, he didn't even give up a solid hit. It was just a bunch of dinks here and there, and I guess he gave up 3 or 4 runs in that inning, and that pretty much turned the tide on the game. So
yeah, it's funny because when you bring up the Twins, kind of in that, I don't know, in that retrospect or that kind of look back, I'm reminded. And granted, this is a little bit apples and oranges, but a little bit about how the Cardinals, if the Cardinals win in 68, then they've won in 64, 67, and 68. Whoa, they're one of the dynasty teams of the 60s. And in some ways, if the Twins win in this four-way race in 67, wow, they're back in the World Series, and suddenly you can start making an argument they're one of the top teams of the 60s. It's just so slippery at times, and I really think the Twins deserve more credit than they kind of receive sometimes about being a preeminent team in the 60s. Do you agree?
Yeah, I do. And you're right. I think if they would have won it in 67, things might have looked differently. And of course, the problem for the Twins then is they ran up against some of the best Oriole teams in history, two teams that were considered among the best in the history of the game, and just loaded with pitching, loaded with power. And the first ALCS could have been won. The second one didn't go nearly as well. They were swept in both of them, but they lost two very close games in the first one. And, gee, what if the Orioles weren't there? That's the,
Sure.
it could have been a lot different, but even 67 would have made a difference. I think you're right.
Yeah. And you bring up a good point. I totally forgot how close they came to beating, this preeminent Orioles team with the 420 game winners, Boog Powell, all this stuff. I mean, all those games the first time they played were really close. I mean, a break or two again the other way. It's the Twins. You split the first two games, suddenly they're looking in much better shape, but it wasn't to be. Let's pinwheel over a little bit. You brought up Miguel Pascual, and I want to go, this is like one of my fatuations a little bit, the Latino impact on the game. And, some of this, we got to go back a little bit farther in time to when the Twins were the Senators, but tell our listeners about, in a sense, how deep this went and how, in a sense, this franchise was one of the first to really develop top Cuban players and what that meant for baseball overall.
Well, maybe they kind of fell into it, but as it played out, the only guy scouting Cuba really was Papa Joe Cambria, and he had developed a relationship exclusively with Calvin Griffith and the Twins organization, and so this became a feeder system for the Senators and Twins, and it became a remarkable pipeline. Camilo Pascual, Pedro Ramos, Tony Oliva, Sandy Valdespino. There's several guys that were key players for them, and the Reds developed a few by virtue of having Havana as their AAA team in the mid -- and Tony Perez comes to mind there. And but this became a remarkable thing for the Twins, and of course then it dried up after Cuba closed. So that also hurt the Twins in their ability to come up with key players, and and of course Griffith was kind of thrifty, as we might say, and the Cuban pipeline didn't cost a lot of money. Yeah. But so that pipeline was kind of a real cheap way to draw on some talent.
Mm-hmm. But it's funny because the Twins again, and I think this would surprise some people. Here they are front and center in terms of this talent pipeline. But also, I think they're front and center. And this really surprised me in your book, because this is something, I address sometimes, with my work, the friction, between some of the Latino players and some of, I guess, the Anglo players or the white players, whatever. This is something you hear about today a little bit. And here were the Twins in the 60s dealing with this, or, in a sense, to come together as a ball club. And I think sometimes team chemistry maybe is overrated. I mean, the Oakland A's are a great example of that in the 70s, but still, it's good to have your clubhouse kind of together. And here were the Twins, not only dealing with this influx of talent from outside the borders, but they're also having to make sure it doesn't blow apart their clubhouse too.
Yeah, I didn't really get to delve into that too far. Tony Oliva didn't want to talk about it. Most players 58 years on wanted to emphasize the positive, and I really couldn't get anyone to say much about it. But I think at the core of it, from my understanding, was an incident on a bus traveling in Detroit from the airport to their hotel. And Dave Boswell, one of the characters of the game and one of the real characters of the Twins, would carry guns on trips, and actually took a handgun out on the bus and started waving it around. It was unloaded, but it's kind of this wacky thing he did. And the two guys that jumped on him were Tony Oliva and Mudcat Grant. And said, put it away. And they were the first to confront him. And then he was defended by Ted Ulander and apparently another player or two. And apparently this did create more friction than anyone would admit at the time. Irma came to the back of the bus. It kind of blew over. But my understanding is a lot of the players of color were upset that it went no further. There really wasn't any real repercussions of it, and nothing that upset them was ever really addressed. And I'm kind of under the impression that was kind of at the core of some of the problems that apparently continued on, but you really never read about them. I didn't see Sports Illustrated cover them. I kind of looked for it in Minneapolis and St. Paul papers, and you just didn't find it. I think part of that too in those days, if a Latin player didn't speak English well, he rarely was interviewed anyway. They were kind of treated like a third world country. You only hear from them if something's bad. And so consequently, that story just didn't seem to ever come out in its day. And like I said, I didn't have much luck bringing it out, among the former players.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know. Here we got another thing that seems so front and center today, handguns being waved around, everything. Here were the Twins ahead of the curve again.
Right. Wow, yeah.
Let's take just maybe a half step back. And one of the things you do so great in Pride of Minnesota is, and something I tried to do in summer of '68 was, is you've already said somewhat, but I want to get a little bit deeper. We've got this great expanse of American history just taking place, somewhat in the background, but every now and then it just comes out and kind of taps baseball on the shoulder or even shakes them by the lapels. And of course, some of the things going on in '68, we've got Vietnam, we've got the civil rights movement. We've got, the assassinations, Dr. Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the Beatles are coming to Minnesota. I mean, you got the great photograph of George Harrison wearing the Minnesota cap in the book, which is great. I totally forgot about that. And so it's there. How does that impact the team? Maybe even how does it impact baseball? And did that surprise you at all? These kind of links or correlations at times.
Well, certainly linking them was kind of a difficult process. And I think you did it wonderfully. And I just, what stands out to me after reading your book years ago is just your coverage of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination and Robert Kennedy's comments on it that night at a campaign stop in Indianapolis. That part of your book was just extremely moving to me and very much an inspiration for doing the type of book I did do. I don't think I linked some other topics as well. I certainly covered them, and the transition between baseball and non-baseball was a real challenge, and you probably found that too. But the one part of it was the civil rights movement, and Mudcat Grant was a big part of that. He had a roommate, Gary Bell, his first roommate, who was a white guy. They were arguably the first mixed race roommates on the road. Mudcat also addressed the topic of the Twins, where they stayed in Orlando at the time. Griffith, let's face it, kind of a racial bigot. I'll just say that out loud, I guess. But there were 2 hotels in Orlando, both were segregated. And, by '64, '65, most of the teams had found some way to house their players, black and white, in the same hotel. And Griffith didn't really push on this, but there were really only 2 hotels. And there was starting to be some negative feedback in the Twin Cities about this. Some boycotts were brewing and leading up into the '65 season. And as it turned out, a brand new hotel opened up in Orlando, and Griffith quickly moved the team into that hotel. But Mudcat talked about the guys who were part of that push against Griffith, and it was Lenny Green, it was Earl Batty, and that was something that Grant was always willing to talk about and stress. And he also tells a very funny story about him and Earl Batty driving to Met Stadium together repeatedly, and always driving by one of those little black horse jockeys, and definitely a symbol of a more racist time, and how they wound up rooted. And there he tells a story about their efforts to put that thing somewhere where it never be seen again. And I won't say much more than that. We'll leave that story alone. But another typical great Mudcat story. So
Mudcat had so many great stories. But I'm it's funny. You did a great job of it. In your book, and I'm always amazed. Baseball doesn't volunteer for these things. I'm thinking like Jackie Robinson. I'm thinking those '60s, certainly '68. '68, the whole entire decade. Even maybe you could even say in a way after 9/11 and the Yankees, stepping up. And even today with Shani, Showtime and Japanese, and yet we've got this whole controversy about Asian Americans. It's amazing. Baseball, maybe more than other sports, still, time and time again, something's going on within the fabric of the country, and it's baseball that suddenly finds itself at the crossroads, or at some kind of having to make a decision. And again, that's something I thought you did so well in Pride of Minnesota was, it does flare up. It's kind of back there. I think baseball is always saying, yeah, I don't want, I'm just focused on my next at bat. I mean, all these cliches they love to say. Yet, the world kind of creeps out, and there they are. I mean, I'm just even thinking a couple of nights ago, the shooting, at the Nats ballpark, and here we are back with guns and violence and what's going on in the country, and it's just remarkable. And you being a longtime baseball observer, does that strike you at all as kind of odd, or even appropriate, or even needed in a way? It's time for the national pastime to step up. Something's gotten crazy here.
Mm-hmm. I have to say, I found it remarkable that the players last season took a stand and decided to sit out games. It was a remarkable thing to see, and and the players, of course, in the 60s didn't have that freedom of free agency. They were tied to a team, and you had to watch your step. You didn't necessarily speak out on things. And Grant had a couple incidents where he made some noise and got into some minor trouble. It never, I don't think it ever got him traded per se, but there again, the game has been at the forefront of, don't mean to give it too much credit here, but Jackie Robinson clearly was one of the first civil rights pioneers. And I think here you got a game where, in time, black and white players were, sharing rooms together and learning that, hey, we're not much different than one another. And we do have these things in common, and we're both basically playing a difficult game and trying to survive in it. And, we didn't hear much about that angle of it, but, we can even talk now. I mean, you ask most white people, do you really have a black friend? Or ask a black person that same thing. And, and I can say, well, gee, Mudcat Grant and Gary Bell have been lifelong friends and close friends for, all these years. So, in a very more quiet way, the game has been sort of part of moving things forward in a positive way. And I was just so impressed with what the players did last year. I would have never expected that. But again, they've got a little more freedom, a little more power. It's a different day. So
yeah, well said. Well said. Did and maybe we've already touched on him, but especially you grew up with this team. Did you have a favorite? Who's your favorite player?
Oh, it'd be hard to say one. It was really Harman Killebrew and Tony Oliva in those days.
Sure. Sure. I mean, what hitters? And we never really touched on Bobby Allison too. I mean, what a murderer's row there. But yeah, that's
No, those were kind of the two, and I liked Allison a lot as well. Interestingly, he was just a wonderful athlete, a terrific athlete. Was a star football player and baseball player at University of Kansas, not far from his boyhood home. And him and Killebrew kind of became the version of the M&M boys, the version of Mantle and Maris, and both of them were very unassuming. Kind of interesting because Allison was a little more of a social guy, which actually Killebrew, that was his quote. Well, he was a more social guy than me, but they both kind of just did their work. They really didn't make a lot of noise. They weren't loud in the clubhouse. And Allison also did a lot of charity work and just didn't talk about it. And I liked Allison too, but I think Killebrew probably overshadowed all of the players at that, early in the day until Oliva and Peru came along.
Yeah. Killebrew was amazing. I mean, and probably deserves, he's gotten a lot of credit, but man deserves, even more than he's received and such. The segue here one last time. I mean, tell us a little bit about, obviously, your work with Baseball Digest and such, and you want to touch on that, and maybe most importantly, how did that influence you doing this book, even the Oliva book? How's it just influence your overall writing?
It didn't have a significant impact, to be honest with you. My work at the magazine is largely on the editorial side, getting copy ready for final, for final print. And I wasn't really part, networking, or I wasn't part of the process of deciding on stories or contacting writers or players, former players. And on the other hand, that meant I didn't have to sit at a phone from 9 to 5. So, if on any given day the book was just, flowing, I would just stay with it. And, maybe I'd edit that article in the middle of the night after that. But the other thing it afforded me, of course, was that when we first put an issue to bed, I'd have a week or so where I could just binge on that book. And as long as I could stay awake and write, I would do that. And so it helped me more from a time management standpoint than anything else, really. So,
yeah, I also found when I was editing much more earlier in my career too, that, it was maybe a little bit more of a cautionary tale. Sometimes I'd be editing so they're going, oh man, I'm not, whatever I do, I'm not doing it that way.
I guess there's some of that. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I understand that. Yes.
Put that over there. We'll avoid that at all costs. What are you working on now? What's, if you would like to tell us, what are you thinking?
Well, believe it or not, I'm actually not working on anything.
No, I think you're hiding it from us. You just don't want to tell us.
Yeah, and I did that with the earlier projects, as I just didn't have a lot of confidence about, whether they'd really sell or be that good. And I finished writing both of them before I even tried to sell them. But as it turns out, I'm way closer to 70 than I am to 60, and retirement does loom, and I'm kind of enjoying the fact that right now I'm not burying myself in work, and undoubtedly what'll happen is once I retire, I'll get the bug again, and there'll be something. At this point, I couldn't even tell you what it might be, but I'm sure there'll be another writing project at some point. So
yeah, well, it's probably my last question, but baseball has some, I don't want to say problems. I got some difficulties at times and such right now. We've also, we don't have as you well know, we don't have a collective bargaining agreement yet for next year, and such. Gaze into your crystal ball a little bit. Where are you with baseball maybe in a couple years? I mean, are you upbeat, you boffo about it, or are you a little bit concerned about perhaps some aspects or directions the game's taking?
Yeah, I'd say very concerned. I think more than anything right now, coming off the pandemic, getting a CBA in place is just instrumental. They just can't afford to have a labor layoff. And I think we've heard some more positive news lately. Some of the discussion about some of the specifics of what the game might be down the road have shown that there apparently is some negotiation going on, and that's very encouraging. Because, I don't know, the idea of speeding up the game, the solutions at this point have been very disappointing. I just don't think they're targeting that. I have to admit, unless it's a team or a particular circumstance, I'm not driven to just sit in front of a game. I now have a long habit of working in front of games, and as long as they drag on the way they do, that's going to kind of be my way to relate to it. I find it difficult to just sit and watch a game generally. And I never thought I'd advocate for a pitch clock, but I'm almost getting there. I just, that's, I hate to even admit it, because I've been the opposite for so long, and of course the other side of it is the launch angle, home run angle of it, and the 3 true outcomes. And I miss the Billy Martin game with triples and going first to third and seeing infielders dive for balls. And I don't know what percentage of outs these days that are not strikeouts or fly balls, but it just seems like an incredibly high percentage. And I just don't find the game as nearly as exciting as I used to. Maybe some of it's age, maybe some of it's these issues, but I think it's a crucial time for the game. And if they better get a CBA in place, and I hope they find some way to bring young people in, and I don't know if that's happening or not. The numbers are saying we're having younger crowds, or people are being drawn into the game or not, but what I'm seeing suggests no. We'll see going forward. So
I'm totally with you. As well said. I think you raised a number of the concerns I have, and may a lot of people who love this game have too. So, well, I know you're working on something there, but you just won't tell us. So.
You'll be the first to know.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Don't call in the middle of the night though. I'll falling asleep watching some game.
What's next on your bill, if you don't mind me asking?
Oh, I'm playing around with a new novel, so we'll see what happens with that. So, yeah, I feel like it's like one of those times where I'm a little bit out on thin ice. I'm finishing the project, and like you, I'm like creeping away from shore, and I'm listening for the cracks on there, and I'm ready plunge through. But yeah, you call me, I'll call you. It'll be good.
Well, I admire that you've jumped into fiction too. I took a fiction writing class about a decade or so just to see if I might want to dabble in that someday. And I haven't written it off, but it's just a whole other animal. And I just respect anybody that can do both fiction and nonfiction. I just don't know if I'll ever try that. So,
well, thank you. Now, there's some days I feel like I don't do either one very well, but it's all right.
I'll disagree with that, certainly. So,
all right. Well, Thom, thank you for your time. Thanks for being part of this session of Baseball Pandemic Book Club. People, go out and get this book, especially if you're a Twins fan. I think the Twins deserve more respect at times, and I've always been championing that. So it's a great book, and especially if you want to know more about this team or grew up certainly with this team, you're going to find out amazing things. And Thom has done an outstanding job. So Thom, thank you very much. I hope our paths cross in person at some point. Maybe we'll do a ball game together. That could be a lot of fun.
That'd be wonderful. Better days are ahead, I'm sure. It might take a little while yet, but better days are ahead.